Until the rise of digital acquisition in cinema, cameras were more about the practical aspects than about the image. The image itself was created by the film stock on its development. There were few suppliers of stock, Kodak Eastman being the major player, and stock choices were usually limited to color balance and various sensitivities. The chemistry of film got better and better over the decades, meaning that higher ISO film with less grain was available. 2010's Shutter Island looks very detailed. 1976 Taxi Driver looks considerably softer. Both were shot spherical and have a nice master. It's mostly the chemistry of the film that makes the difference here. As the negative was a limiting factor, lenses were usually as sharp and contrasty as possible and not shot wide open unless necessary to get the right exposure. Of course, there were different film formats and variants with corresponding cameras over the decades, too many to go through here, but we have a pretty decent roundup in our Scope Chapter 1 if you're interested. The dominant format was and is 35mm film in different variants like Academy, Techniscope and Super 35 that simply use more or less surface area of the same substrate. Besides the stock, cinematographers could create their desired look with lighting, exposure, use of different lenses and filtration, and different color timings or processing during development. Film stock is said to offer a dynamic range of about 14 stops, depending on the specific chemistry, and that is a lot. More than most digital cameras offer even today. Highlights clip late and the roll-off looks beautiful. On the other hand, sensitivity is bad by digital standards and underexposures quickly takes a toll. Super 35 is often stated as having a resolution of about 4K, but that is largely dependent on the stock and generation. 4K scans are more about preserving the grain structure that is important to the perceived resolution. The resolution that modern sensors deliver exceeds the theoretical resolution of a camera negative, and the image is not further degraded in a cine process requiring many generations from negative to screen. A digital 2K image was arguably enough resolution to preserve the details Super 35 can muster, which is why it was the preferred resolution of a master in the digital intermediate process. Analog TV cameras and camcorders had much smaller formats and dynamic range, resulting in a very different look. Emulating the look of 35mm film was a sporty endeavor for filmmakers, including things like depth of field adapters and lighting very carefully to stay within the dynamic range of the camcorders. This brings us to the digital revolution in cinema. Or is it an evolution? I suppose it's both. Here are some important steps in the history of digital cinema cameras. The first cameras that were used in cinema and that were not video cameras designed for broadcast were Sony CineAlta cameras that had the same small 3 CCD technology used in camcorders, requiring special lenses developed for the format. 2002 Star Wars Attack of the Clones was pioneering here. The CineAltas had very limited dynamic range and details, but the practical advantage to see what the camera was actually shooting and to review takes without having to wait for dailies was undeniable from the get-go. 2002 brought the Thomson Viper camera that also used 3 to 3/3 inch sensors. This camera was David Fincher's digital gateway drug, and he shot Zodiac and some scenes of The Curious Case of Benjamin Button on the Viper.
Some sleazy plan to get me to go home with you?
2003, the first cinema camera with a single CCD, the Dalsa Origin, was released. A sensor size similar to 35mm film allowed the use of regular cine lenses. It was very expensive and didn't score major credits in cinema except for some effect scenes in James Bond: Quantum Solace. In 2005, the Panavision Genesis took the crown of the digital cinecams. Ironically, it didn't let the crew review the shot material, taking away one of the major advantages of digital productions. According to Fincher, that was the reason why he didn't use the Genesis for Zodiac. The Genesis was rebranded and updated to the Sony F35 in 2008. Also in 2005, Arri introduced their first shot at digital cinema with the D-20. It only has a few credits, but among them is Guy Ritchie's first digital film, 2008's Rock'n'Roller. 2007 was the year that RED introduced the RED I. The relatively low price compared to cameras like the Genesis made digital cinema accessible for mainstream. And while it didn't score blockbusters, probably due to reliability issues, it forced the industry to move. 2008 brought the silicon imaging Si2K, a 60mm sensor digital cinecam with a detachable head. It was used in Slumdog Millionaire to attract less attention, filming guerrilla style through Mumbai streets. In 2010, Arri released the Alexa that changed cinema on a larger scale. According to many working DOPs, it was the first camera to exceed the quality of 35mm film, technically speaking, delivering a dynamic range of more than 14 stops. Melancholia was one of the first credits of the Alexa. The famous slow-motion sequences of the movie were shot digitally too, but on a dedicated high-speed camera, the Vision Research Phantom. Later cameras from RED like the Epic, Dragon, Helium and V-Raptor have their fans among directors and DOPs. Especially Fincher likes RED, he shot all of his films since The Social Network on RED cameras. Still, the cinema mainstream clearly belonged to Arri and the Alexa. In 2012, the Empire tried to strike back and Sony released the F65 with little impact. It took 5 more years for them to gain relevant market share with the 2017 release of their full-frame Venice. Arri entered the 4K full-frame game with the Alexa LF in 2018. Since then, there were evolutionary steps, but no big revolutions that changed the market significantly. Except maybe a revived interest in analog formats like 70mm and IMAX, mostly thanks to Christopher Nolan and Heute von Hoytema. Meanwhile, the high-end cine cameras got new competitors from the lower-end market and mirrorless cameras. The sensor market collapsed to only a few major players left in the competition, with a clear dominance of Sony that supplies sensors for the majority of camera manufacturers. From the entry-level full-frame camera up to high-end cinema cameras, the sensors are surprisingly similar in design and capability, mostly via CMOS technology, delivering very similar dynamic range and sensitivity. It is amazing how indistinguishable the image tend to be at first glance and in the final result. Advances seem to be so incremental that even a decade-old cinema camera can hold up to modern ones.
Lighting is certainly very important, but what are the other ingredients in the magic sauce?